Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Come in, come in. Pull up a virtual chair. Thanks very much for joining me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, for this latest IEA Book Club event. And I know I say this for all our book club events, but we have a truly tremendous guest for you in this edition of our book club program. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Brad Lips, the CEO of the Atlas Network, which is an organization connecting a global network of more than 400 free market think tanks across nearly 100 countries. Brad is a member also of the John Templeton Foundation, Templeton World Charity Foundation, and the Mont Pelerin Society. He's also on the board of directors for both the American Friends of the IEA and the Institute of Economic Studies Europe. He regularly speaks at events across the world about solutions to poverty, published in a whole range of major media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Forbes, and the like. And if that wasn't enough, he's found a little bit of spare time to write and talk to us about his latest book, Liberalism and the Free Society. He's also a very good friend of me personally and of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Brad, it's absolutely fantastic to have you with us. How are you doing, sir?
No, thanks, Mark. I appreciate the invitation. Looking forward to the conversation here.
So let me introduce our viewers and book club members to this book. It's called Liberalism and the Free Society in 2021. You're basically taking a deep dive into how institutions of liberal democracy are tested, not just in the USA, right across the world by the various challenges of lockdowns, cronyism, cancel culture, much more. And you say in the introduction to the book that it's kind of aimed for people who work or are associated with the freedom movement, but you also hope it finds an audience amongst the liberty curious. I think that's probably the best way that we could describe our IEA audience. It's the liberty curious. So what drove you to write this book, Brad? And have I fairly summarized what it's all about?
Yeah, you have. I think it's been clear over the past 15, 18 months that we're in the midst of a global health crisis. From the beginning, we've been making the case at Atlas Network that we're also in the middle of a global freedom crisis. And as we now begin to move to the late stages of the pandemic, I think it's really important for us to think about how the year 2020 may go down in history as one of those pivotal years that changes the trajectory and maybe in a really negative direction. I think some are resigned to the idea that the new normal has left us less free than we were before. But the point of the book is that this is not preordained, and it draws attention to what I think is a really undervalued asset, which is this community of pro-liberty organizations using scholarship to try to persuade people of a different path we could be taking. And I think that understanding the capabilities of that community and assessing the challenges ahead and maybe thinking about some ways we may need to innovate to do more in the future, this is really pivotal if you care about the future of freedom.
But let me start, because I want to get into all of the issues and the sort of, could 2020-21 be an inflection point? You list a number in the book, 1776. We've long since forgiven you for that, by the way, my friend. 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and now perhaps this year too. But let's start by talking a little bit about the freedom movement, because I think oftentimes, Brad, folk like you and I can bandy these terms around because we're embedded in it, we work in it. But what is it? What do you mean when you're talking about the freedom movement and a network of think tanks? To our viewers who've never come across these terms before, explain it to them.
Sure. A think tank is a pretty broad term that really refers to any organization that is using research and education to develop and popularize new ideas, sometimes in the areas of public policy. And my concentration is in a minority of those organizations that are called think tanks. I focus in on those that are independently run. So they're not part of government or a government agency. They're not, buried within a corporation or beholden to any special interest or industry. The organizations that Atlas Network works with are independent in the sense that they have diverse funding sources and they're therefore committed to a mission. And that mission has some common denominators in that we really believe in the dignity of the individual. And we think most problems are best worked out through voluntary solutions that are worked out in the market or civil society, with real skepticism towards those who first turn to top-down government mandates as a way to address problems in society. So that the groups that, if you're sort of on board with that mission, I think you'd find yourself really applauding the work of the nearly 500 organizations that are now associated with Atlas Network. And we often use the shorthand of the Liberty Movement or the Freedom Movement as a way to talk about that community.
Okay, thanks, Brad. But you mentioned the term think tank. Again, you and I would use this, and it's a term that's in common parlance on both sides of the Atlantic. But what distinguishes, say, a think tank from a lobbying organization or a campaign group? The term's bandied around all the time, but very often I'm asked the question, what is a think tank?
Yeah, I think you're making a really important distinction in that there are ways to try to affect the future of freedom and the values that we share that have to do with getting a particular legislation passed, as a lobbying organization would make it the center of its attention, getting particular candidates in office. We tend to think in the think tank movement or in the freedom movement that there's earlier long-term work that needs to happen in order for those activities to have a better chance of success later. That politics is sort of carrying the ball the last yards towards the end zone, or whatever your appropriate soccer English football metaphor would be. But we think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done on a consistent basis by organizations that are committed to principles and therefore can stay a little bit above the fray and try to talk to people of all parties instead of placing bets on which politician is going to carry the water at the end of the day.
So it's really sort of trying to change through scholarship, but I guess scholarship that's accessible to like the intelligent layperson, right? It's trying to win the battle of ideas over the longer term, rather than trying to win a particular battle over a particular issue or piece of legislation today. It's to try and change the climate of opinion. Am I right?
Right. We're sort of playing that intermediary role between those in academia who are developing new ideas and packaging it in a way that is accessible, that can change hearts and minds among the general public, and those who are particularly influential in the way that policy battles play out.
And so tell me a bit more about the Atlas Network. You're not really a think tank, you're a kind of meta think tank, right? Your aim is to facilitate the think tanks, to link them together, to encourage them, to give them more skills, to make sure they're talking to each other. Tell us a little bit about what you and the Atlas Network do.
Yeah, so Atlas Network is turning 40 years old this very week that we're recording this program, and it was sort of born out of the success of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Anthony Fisher, our common founder, had been involved in the IEA, founding it in the mid-50s. By the Thatcher era, people were waking up to how influential this plucky little organization had become and asking, how do we replicate the experiment? So in 1981, with the encouragement of scholars like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, with a very nice letter from Lady Thatcher herself supporting the idea, Anthony Fisher embarked upon the creation of what's now known as Atlas Network to help organizations, or to help those who wanted to replicate the IEA experiment, help them not have to recreate the wheel, and to help them learn from one another on an ongoing basis. 40 years later, the network has become something pretty impressive. Nearly 500 organizations in nearly 100 countries. When you combine the annual budgets of all these organizations, you get a little bit over $1 billion. There's sort of an 80-20 rule, so there's some well-funded American groups that boost that, but collectively, this is not an insignificant player in the climate of ideas. And the way that Atlas Network tries to systematically strengthen this movement to increase the speed of innovation, and raise the ambitions of its different actors is really through three different prongs of activities. We have the best professional development or training programs for this community. Thanks to our generous donors, we're able to run grant competitions and prize competitions that put resources, about $6 million annually that comes from Atlas to our partners' projects to increase economic and personal liberty. And then we have an increasingly great marketing and communication shop and an events footprint. In a normal year, we run multi-day international conferences on 5 different continents. And the purpose of all this is to really create a sense of camaraderie and community among these players, so they don't feel like a big fish in a small pond. We drag them into a much bigger pond where they realize how much more they could be doing for liberty. And thanks to the programs we're able to develop, they can learn what's worked for others and accelerate their own achievement.
So you've now written this book, 40 years on from the foundation of the Atlas Network, Liberalism and the Free Society in 2021. We're determined to make sure that people who actually believe in freedom claim or reclaim the word liberalism on this side of the Atlantic. It's sometimes, I think, misused on the other side of the Atlantic. But here's your audit, Brad. Basically, it's an audit of the state of freedom and the state of the freedom movement across the globe. Tell our viewers what that audit is. What's the state of freedom across the planet, and what is the state of this movement spreading ideas in favor of freedom, human dignity, peace, and prosperity?
Yeah, well, I sort of play off this the cover image of it's a little ambiguous about whether this is a sunset or a sunrise that you see on the cover. So that's sort of the question about the state of the free society. And I guess the big spoiler alert is that while I think it's really easy to be pessimistic right now, and I don't shy away from cataloging all of the challenges that we're facing coming out of the pandemic, and certainly with increasing authoritarianism in many parts of the world, including China. There are a lot of clouds on the horizon, but I'm pretty convinced that it would be self-defeating to consider it a sunset, and there's actually a lot of reason for hope. And that's what I try to present here, that the community that is collaborating with Atlas Network has in fact rattled off a number of pretty impressive wins. If you look through history over our 40 years, there's a lot of big changes that have happened that our partners have cheered on and been a part of. As the organizations that connect Atlas Network have become more sophisticated in recent years, I think there's reason to be bullish that we need to keep raising the game. We're not nearly where we should be, but there's more hope out there than you might get if you're just reading headlines on sometimes the depressive cable news here.
So you're pretty confident, are you, Brad, that the cover of your book shows that the sun of liberty is actually rising? It's only just gone over the horizon. It's got much further to rise, rather than that liberty is slowly but surely disappearing from the globe.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things that we realized. I was actually having a discussion with a partner in Russia, of all places, and asking, how she and her team remain optimistic, how they get up and do their work every day, because they do operate with under a lot of adversity, and knowing that there's authoritarian clouds all around them. But she points out, if you never know when things are going to change, and if we were just measuring progress by the state of government in different countries, that would be a pretty sad way to look at the world. And in fact, those of us who are sort of called to be activists for liberty and to try to generate new ideas that could popularize ideas that are better than what we've been living through during COVID-19, we just need to remain confident there is going to be a moment of change, and therefore we need to be present when it happens and hope that the work we've been doing can carry the day and influence things in a more positive direction.
Brad, I always find you, and I often find this to be an American trait, sort of a permanent optimism. all the time, which I'm sure is one of the great things that has made the United States of America such a great country. And I'm not saying I disagree with you, but it's incumbent upon me to play devil's advocate, right? To sort of say, well, hang on 1 second here. Things look pretty bleak. Let me start by saying, and as I say, you mentioned a range of dates at the start of the book and suggest that perhaps this year is another major inflection point in history. Friedrich Hayek would have warned that crises like wars, or I guess pandemics, almost inevitably lead to the state and governments taking a huge leap forward in terms of the slice of human activity that they control. This was sort of famously his warning from The Road to Serfdom, that powers are accrued by governments at a time of war, literal war in his case, but we could see over the past 12 months at a time of dealing with a public health emergency. And those powers are seized at pace and repented at leisure. And before you know it, they start to be applied to peacetime as well. Why would COVID-19 be any different here? I mean, the lesson of the UK was during the Second World War, well, we've successfully won the war through central planning. Why don't we apply state planning rather than free individual choice to a whole range of other problems, education, housing, all the rest? Aren't we in danger? Isn't the downside that's what's going to happen here? We've had huge state intrusion to deal with COVID, and might there not then be an appetite amongst lawmakers or indeed the public to apply that intrusion to a whole wide range of other human ills?
Yeah, but part of the book really takes a look at some of the cultural reasons why, especially in the US, and I'm sure it's true in parts of Western Europe, we've become safety obsessed and willing to defer to authority too often for my taste. But I think that this is the case we need to make, that if there's anything we should have learned over the last 18 months, is that the resilience of societies comes from the bottom up, that the adaptability of innovators, of business owners who figured out how to operate under really difficult circumstances. That's like the heroic story of what's happened over the past year. And we've seen too often that the top-down mandates that came from government officials were clumsy, prioritized addressing one risk while being completely blind to other risks and preventing people from making the choices about trade-offs in their own lives. I think there's a really important story for us to tell about how we've lived through the top-down world and none of us liked it. I think that should be the takeaway.
Do you think, Brad, on our side of the ledger, people who want to see a world in which individual men and women have much more power to determine their own lives, and the state and bureaucrats and politicians really considerably less power to control our lives, do you think we actually have a tougher story to tell? I mean, to give you an example, over the course of the pandemic in the United Kingdom, the people who've been celebrated, and I'm not suggesting that they don't deserve our thanks, are people who nurses and doctors in the National Health Service, the public health system, the public healthcare system. Very little applause for, I don't know, supermarket workers, delivery drivers. I found it absolutely astonishing that the private supply lines held up so well. Even in the middle of a pandemic where everything was closed down, you could basically get to a supermarket and pretty much buy all of the goods that you could buy in normal times. This struck me as an incredible success of ingenuity. But that tale, our story, doesn't seem to get told as loudly as the applauding those who are on the state side of the economy. Why is that? Have we got is it that we're just not articulating well enough, or do we have a more complicated story to tell than perhaps those who reach for the lever of state power to deal with human ills have?
Yeah, I do think that we have, call it a built-in disadvantage, that when the free enterprise system is working effectively, it's coordinating such a complex array of activities so as to be invisible to the consumer. So it's very easy for us to take for granted all the blessings of living in a free society And it's really when we just have the the absence of those things that we are awakened to it. So making the case that that the real power of society comes from all these voluntary interactions that are coordinated through the market is a difficult challenge on its face. I do think that the pandemic gave us some real examples where we can say, well, look at how bad regulation stifled that at different times. I'm really proud of some of our partners here in the United States that were able to remove a number of laws that were called certificate of need laws, which exist in many states to make sure that you don't bring in new healthcare facilities unless there's a documented need, and you can't have, you have to limit the number of licensed medical professionals in different categories. And this made no sense when we had a real disparity of COVID cases in different states. So they were able to wipe away some of these regulations that were only preventing the resilience that we need in society. And I think there's a lot of examples like that where we can say it was where we had competition and that things work. It's where we relaxed the regular rules, as I think we've seen in the UK with its far superior rollout of the vaccine than in the EU. These are things that should point people towards an appreciation for why we should be really nervous about giving government too many cards to play, and why we should trust a voluntary society more often.
Yeah, do you think we'll be able to pull together across this vast atlas network of freedom-loving institutions and think tanks? Some of these, I mean, it sounds almost absurd to say it in the context of what's been a ghastly pandemic, but some of these good news stories, you mentioned the UK vaccine rollout, we certainly stormed out of the block faster than most similar countries, in large part due to the fact that we didn't go through layer and layer and layer and layer of the precautionary principle of looking for reasons to stop drugs or vaccines coming to market. And if that's true of COVID-19, one might argue whether we should apply that same fleet-footed, rather faster decision-making approach to other drugs that might come on stream to deal with, I don't know, dementia or cancer or whatever, that it shouldn't be a unique case for COVID-19. Do you think we'll be able to pull together these examples of how deregulation vastly assisted us in troubled times, and to try and persuade people that if that's the lesson in troubled times, the same sort of principles appear in peacetime too?
Right. I mean, that's certainly the hope. I think that, there's amid all the despair of COVID-19, and it's I think we have to be real careful about talking about the silver linings to it and the things we can learn. But certainly we've embarked on a number of really ambitious social experiments in schooling as well as in healthcare, and on so many different dimensions. It'll be very interesting to learn across different countries what's worked and what hasn't, and we probably need a little bit of distance from the event to really be able to do a sober analysis of that. But I think that's part of the power of the network, is that we're going to be able to bring this together in a pretty exciting way, because we've been through something that was unprecedented, but we need to be ready for the next crisis, because there will be a next crisis. And the faster we can learn and teach these lessons about what is prudent and what is heavy-handed, the better off we'll be in the future.
Now, you mentioned a little earlier, Brad, that you were talking to partners of Atlas in Russia, a difficult country in which to promote ideas of freedom, certainly compared to the USA or the UK. And I want to get to the nub of a problem that I know you and I have struggled with for a long time. How do you measure the state of freedom across the world? How can you measure such an abstract thing? And how can you work out the extent to which the freedom movement, the Atlas network, and others associated with it are making things better rather than having no impact at all? It seems to me incredibly difficult in the think tank community to measure that. If you're a regular company, you've got some automatic measurements, share price, profit, but the IEA is not floated on the stock exchange. It doesn't seek to make a profit. We use all the money we have to try and spread these ideas. sometimes in rather non-benign circumstances, sometimes in better circumstances. But how can we audit freedom? What's the best way of doing it? And how can we work out whether freedom improving or not is down to us, or is instead an act of God or chance or some such like?
Right. Well, yeah, the way that we measure it is very, very imperfectly. But I'll mention one thing that is in the book that I think is a constructive advance in what we'd like to prove. I'll tell you what would be my holy grail. If we begin with the idea that we all want human flourishing, we now have pretty convincing empirical evidence that the more economic freedom you have in society, you have more people thriving and less poverty. That's pretty well documented, thanks to the Economic Freedom of the World report that our friends at Fraser Institute have been doing for 3 decades now. The question remains, though, how do you increase economic freedom? Sometimes that happens when you have sympathetic policymakers who you can, as a think tank, you can be interfacing with and promoting an idea, but they tend to only be receptive when there's a broader public consensus around this. And I'm really happy that I got to be hooked up with a research project that had been begun by an Argentine scholar and a Hungarian scholar who began to study something called economic mentality. They were mining the World Values Survey. It's been done for a number of decades to isolate questions that give a sense as to whether people believe that markets produce efficient outcomes, whether they produce fair outcomes, or whether you need government to redistribute wealth, whether at the end of the day people are responsible for their own economic well-being or not. And by looking at a handful of questions in the World Values Survey, in this project, we were able to create an index that tries to assess the economic mentality of different countries. So in this Liberalism and the Free Society 2021 book, one chapter previews the findings from the more academic paper that's going to be published in the journal this fall. But at the end of the day, I think that would be if we can find the causal links that say investment in freedom movement activities leads to higher economic mentality, which increases the opportunities for policy reform in the direction of economic freedom and improves human well-being. My job as a fundraiser becomes a lot easier. I think those linkages exist, but proving them empirically is near impossible. But we're making some headway. If we're only 50% of the way there before, I think maybe we're at 53% or so with this new global index for economic mentality.
Cool.
But one of the things I'll mention, Mark, is that you said it's tough for a think tank to understand whether they are creating return on investment, since they're organized as nonprofits. They're not supposed to do that. So therefore, do you know if you're optimizing on the resources your donors are giving you? This is part of why I think it's so important for organizations to be networked together. I think that's really the big value. So the IEA is doing amazing work on many different dimensions, but when you meet your peers from all these different countries, including those that are operating in difficult spots like Russia or Burundi, you start to say, wow, that they're doing something innovative too. Let's be attentive to it. And by expanding that that universe of comparison that you have, I think it forces you to think about new ways you can innovate. So I think that's maybe an important dimension that really does help us gauge whether we're being impactful, even though putting a hard number on it is difficult.
And your book, Brad, shares actually some of these impacts. I mean, I very much agree with you. It's extremely difficult to put them into a spreadsheet and work out an algorithm and come out with an exact number. I mean, I think it's worth attempting that exercise, and you've done that. But it's also, we're in the storytelling business, right? I mean, we tell true stories, but we're in the storytelling business. And your book has a number of stories about things which have been concrete achievements. Share one or two of those with us.
Yeah, one of the things that I was excited to share in the book is some photojournalism that we had commissioned on 4 different continents with partners of ours. And so we have some pretty pages in the book, which is maybe a first for an Atlas Network publication. But what we've realized is that if we're going to better win over hearts and minds, we need to be telling the personal stories behind our partners' victories. So, one of the things that had been a problem in India had been the harassment of street vendors, where much of the economy actually plays out. And our partner, Center for Civil Society, has done yeoman's work in transforming the way that the law looks at street vendors from being a public nuisance to being an asset that needs to be protected. And we see this through the eyes of a man named Dinesh, who has who's kept records over the 30 years that he's been selling little baubles on the streets of New Delhi. He had kept this incredible file of all the times that his goods had been confiscated, had been shaken down for bribes by the corrupt local police that knew they had this impunity. That no longer exists because the law has changed, and more than that, the Center for Civil Society has helped create an association of the street vendor community to help each other get the legal representation when they do have these continued violations of the law. It's one thing to pass the law, but to see it implemented in the right spirit is another thing, and it's been great to see that. So that's like one of the stories we get to tell. We're all excited because our friends in Ukraine, there's a number of organizations there that are working towards the removal of a prohibition on the sale of farmland that had been returned after the end of the Soviet Union to individuals who had possessed it in their family once before, but there was a land sale moratorium that prevented them from actually using it as their own property. That, as of this month, has been lifted, so they can again sell their land, and it's really maybe the biggest property rights victory of the post-World War II era in Europe, with the number of people affected. So we have our story about Victor, who has labored through that policy battle and now stands to be freer than he was a couple months ago as a consequence.
I think this is a fascinating insight, Brad, and it's one I need to, and all of us here at the IEA, I think, could learn more and more from. That sometimes those of us on the pro-freedom side of the argument, I know I'm guilty of this, think that there can be a sort of scientific proof with a whole load of numbers that show how free markets and personal liberty helps change the world. But it makes you sound a bit robotic sometimes if your entire argument is about bar charts and pie charts and line graphs and the rest of it, that we actually need to, I think, get better in the years to come. Even better. Atlas has helped us make big strides in this area. Talking about the individual stories that illustrate this, it might just be the tale of one man or one woman, but it illustrates the benefits of freedom, and perhaps appeals a bit more initially to the heart rather than focusing all of our efforts on the kind of numerate head, right?
Yeah, I'll tell you one story where I sort of woke up to this. Our partner in South Africa has done some amazing work helping those who had been victimized under apartheid to navigate sort of the Byzantine process to get title to their land, which had been lost more than a century ago. And when we asked them to help us find some stories so we could try to do this, and the first one they came back to us with was about a woman named Maria Malthupi, who had just turned 99 years old as she received her property title. And in my mind, when I first saw it, I was thinking, well, this doesn't help us make the sort of the intellectual case that she can go back to school. All these things were unlikely for Maria Malthupi at nearing age 100. But then the quote that she gave when she received her title within this little ceremony they did, she said, "Now I have something to pass to my children." And I feel like that was one of those that kind of struck me in the heart and said, oh, this isn't all about the GDP growth projections. This is about human dignity and about something that she can take pride in. And we need to remember that it really is about human dignity first. And it's wonderful economic consequences that flow later, but that shouldn't be the heart of the story if we're going to appeal to people outside our own economics bubble.
And I want to finish, Brad, just with a couple of quick questions. You've spoken about the incredible growth in the Freedom Network, with Atlas overseeing this over the 40 years of its existence. think tanks. I mean, the IEA was more or less the first one on the scene all the way back in the 1950s. This is now a huge, vibrant network, really, all across the planet. But in you auditing the strength and the present thinking of the free market pro-freedom network and what we need to do better, what do you think the biggest opportunity is in, say, the next 10 years and the biggest threat to us over the next 10 years? Atlas is now 40 years old. Over the next 10 years, before you get to your half century, what do you see as the great opportunity for us and the biggest threat?
Yeah, so one of the things that our movement has been adapting to is this information revolution, where we've gone from information scarcity. When Anthony Fisher got started in this industry, you needed to explain why it was unwise to have a nationalized car industry in Britain. You needed to look at how the broken windows theory of policing could improve outcomes in New York with its crime problem. That's what the Manhattan Institute did with Anthony Fisher in the 80s and early 90s. And but now we have this information abundance, and the challenge is to cut through the clamor and get our ideas heard by new audiences. And that has required our organizations to become more like communication shops. And the challenge, of course, is to make sure that at the same time that we strive to be A+ in the talent that we're bringing to that challenge, to not lose sight of the principles themselves, the commitment to quality scholarship, and to not get dragged into partisan politics that are sometimes exciting and easier to fundraise for, but neglect the long-term challenges. And I'll say part of what I see as a big opportunity in front of us is to look anew at who our allies can be as we try to develop this more agile fleet of foot style that, Mark, you've emphasized for our movement. I look in the last chapter of this book, there's a chapter called The Path Forward, that looks at how politics in the US, and I think this is echoed in Europe and elsewhere, have given us an opportunity to find unlikely allies on the center left that may be increasingly worried about the authoritarian streak behind some who have been in their sort of political tent for some time, how the right of center tent has also been fractured in ways, and we might be able to reclaim that word liberalism in its authentic meaning. And that's going to require us to be a little more open-minded, no longer trying to create F.A. Hayek fan clubs, but really focusing in on getting things done and realizing that there's a lot more common ground out there with people who are not formally part of the movement. We've got to make a good case that they can work with us and that we're there in good faith trying to find solutions that benefit real people.
I think that's a fascinating challenge, Brad. And you referenced some of Dr. Steve Davies' thinking about political realignment and how things shuffle around us. And that actually underscores how vitally important it is not to associate oneself with any particular political party or politician, because not just do you rise and fall with them, but in fact, all of the tectonic plates could be moving around us, not just the rise and fall of the popularity of individual politicians or different political parties, right? We could be looking at a very different political landscape, I think, in maybe 5 or 10 years' time to the one that we've been accustomed to of confronting over the past 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, I certainly think that's the case, and it could go in different directions. Stephen has outlined how he sees the new political realignment taking shape, and that worries me, the way that he's seeing it. And I think it's incumbent upon us to look at how we could be influencers of what ultimately happens and where new alliances can be built. So yeah, it's an important project for a lot of people to be thinking on, and I hope the book gives a launching pad for more discussions on that topic.
So I've left the most crucial question to last, Brad. Where can our viewers and listeners get a copy of the book, and when? How do they get their hands on it?
Yeah, I mean, you can come to the atlasnetwork.org website, but the book is also available at Amazon.com and Barnes & Nobles and most online retailers. So yeah, I hope that it'll be a useful read for those on the call who are interested in learning more about the freedom movement and the contribution it can make to a freer society going forward.
And we'll make sure that we put links to all of those ways that you can get it into the show notes below. So decide whether you want to get it from Amazon or visit the Atlas Network's website. All of those details be in the show notes below. Brad, we've gone way over time, but it's always fascinating to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope now freedom's coming back to some extent. It won't be too long before I can see you in person again. But thanks so much for writing this book. Thanks for your incredible leadership at the Atlas Network and bringing together this freedom movement and building it. It's been an absolute pleasure having you as a guest for this IEA Book Club event.
Thanks, Mark. This has been a treat. Appreciate
Good.
this.
Great to see you, Brad. Catch up with you in person soon, I hope. Thanks, everybody, for watching, to our book club members, our donors. If you're watching on YouTube and want to support our work, at the very least, make sure you subscribe and hit the thumbs up button underneath this video. If you've got a few pennies spare and you'd like us to continue to put together these broadcasts for you, do please consider becoming an IEA online patron. You can find out more information about that by going to patreon.com/IEA London, or again, click on the show notes below. It's been great having you with us. Thanks again to my good friend, Brad Lips. Enjoy the rest of your day. Over and out.